Alors, on voit bien ma présentation? Oui, parfait. Alors, bon matin tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. So, just before we start, I'm going to give you some few instructions. Alors, juste avant qu'on commence, je vais vous donner quelques instructions parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons la présentation qui est offerte en anglais et en français. Donc, je vais juste vous dire comment arriver à la version en français. Alors, juste vous dire que cette présentation, finalement, a été possible grâce au partenariat canadien pour l'agriculture, qui est une entente entre le gouvernement du Canada et du Québec du programme Innovation Agri-Food Program. Je vais le dire en anglais. So, just to let you know, before we start, this webinar was possible with the funding support through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, an agreement between the Government of Canada and Quebec from the Innovation Agri-Food Program. Alors, juste avant de commencer, pour les personnes qui aimeraient écouter la présentation en français, dans le bas de votre écran, vous avez un petit globe qui est écrit « Interprétation » et vous avez qu'à sélectionner le canal en français. So for people who would like to listen to this webinar in English, I invite you to click on the globe and select the English button. At the end of this webinar, we'll have a question period. So we invite you to write all your questions in the Q&A box. During the presentation, Richard will probably ask some questions to the audience. We invite you to write your answer in the chat box right here. So also at the end of this presentation, we'll invite you to fill in a survey. You can choose the French or the English version in the right corner of the survey. Alors, pour ceux qui sont en français, à la fin de la présentation, on vous invite à remplir un sondage. Puis, ce que je disais, c'est que vous pouvez le remplir en français en cliquant sur la langue que vous souhaitez dans le coin droit. Juste avant, parce que des fois, à la fin, les gens partent plus rapidement, on voulait vous dire qu'il y aura un webinaire le 24 février qui sera donné par Sébastien Buzinski. Le sujet sera sur les pneumonies. So for English people, because sometimes at the end of the webinar, people are leaving rapidly, but just to let you know that we'll have another webinar on February 24th. It will be given by Sébastien Buzinski. It will be only offered in French, and the topic will be around pneumonia. So, Richard, I would be ready to give you the mic.
Okay, great. And I'll share my screen then?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity, and I really enjoyed connecting with your audience last spring. And so today I'm talking about a different subject, but I've done some work looking at lamb finishing systems and their impact on meat quality. And I thought I'd talk about that today. Hopefully this will resonate with you as well. I know we have slightly different markets, but I think we have a lot of things in common as well between our markets here in Michigan and in your part of Canada. So what I'll do is I will talk about some of the diversity of our markets. And then, of course, I'm going to want to understand yours a little bit better, even though I have a general idea for that. And then I'm going to discuss some of the factors that impact the growth of lambs, their feed efficiency, and their product quality. And then at the end, I also have done a research project where we've looked at a few different rearing systems, and we have some kind of interesting results to share on how they affected product quality and also the economics of rearing lambs. Now, perhaps not all of these rearing systems are perfectly relevant for what you might be doing in Quebec, but I think there's some principles here that might be educational at the very least, and perhaps transferable to your systems. So the lamb rearing systems, we basically have, well, we have a number of systems, but you could break it down into systems in the more intensified production where we essentially use grain feeding the whole time. So we'll allow lambs access to what we call creep feed during the pre-weaning period. So, you know, they're separated, they can access grain while they're nursing. Their moms can't access it. And then we keep them on that program right to weaning. So basically, we just finish these lambs or get them to the market endpoint as fast as possible on a high calorie diet. The other way that's often done in many parts of the US and probably some parts of Canada, where we use what's called a background finishing system, where we actually slow the rate of growth for a variable period of time. And then at the end, we allow some grain finishing. So I'll compare and contrast these systems. So in the United States, we do have a big diversity, and probably in North America in general. In the US, we have smaller lambs. We call them milk-fed lambs. These are lambs that are often marketed right at weaning or very close shortly thereafter. They're often called milk-fed lambs, and these are generally for Italian and Orthodox Christian markets. They're generally pretty small. They're often sold as whole lambs. These are live weights I'm showing here. They're 16 to 22 kilo live weights, or slightly larger for the Orthodox market. And these, in the United States at least, these are pretty seasonal markets. They're mostly revolve around Easter and Christmas. So these are smaller lambs. Then we have probably our largest market in this part of the United States would be for largely, broadly speaking, the Muslim customer. They're going to be killed halal, and these are going to be in a 30 to 50 kilo size. So there's a pretty big variation there, but they're certainly lighter and less fat than what we have in the United States, which we call our large finished lambs. Now, these can get very big. In the Western United States in particular, they create very large lambs. They have larger breeds as well, but they also grow these lambs, you know, probably past their, what I would call their optimal market endpoint. These lambs are range in size from like 55 to 70 kilos. So I guess my question is, if you could describe your markets to me, do you sell categories 1 and 2 primarily? And if you sell categories 1 and 2, you know, what percentage of lambs might you sell to both of those markets? I understand from Stephanie that you don't necessarily sell these large lambs, and I know that's not a typical Canadian market. Did you want to provide that answer later, perhaps, or should I just keep moving?
Yeah, I've seen that nobody has written yet. Maybe we could give them a few seconds, but
Yeah, no
maybe
problem.
you can continue and we can get back.
Sure. All right. Yeah. Okay. So each of these markets has unique body composition targets, or I'll call that, you know, degrees of fatness. And these lighter lamb market standards are less well defined. Basically, in our milk-fed lambs, these smaller lambs, they're sold at weaning or within a short time post-weaning. And generally, they're sold at less than 50% of their mature size. So, you know, they can be from smaller breeds. And in our markets, premiums are paid for lambs that have a higher degree of body fatness, which is achieved by higher growth rate. So generally, to have the premium for these lambs, we want them growing at least 275 grams per day. prefer to be 350 or as, pretty much as fast as possible. And as I'll describe, that definitely affects how they partition energy into the carcass. So if they're fed a high calorie diet, a high energy diet, they're going to accrete more fat, which is a critical thing for these lambs. So we're looking at carcass fatness of at least 14%. So there's a picture of some of these lambs. I raise sheep myself, and these are some lambs from my own farm. And these are the type of lambs that we produce for these markets. They're right after weaning, and they're, very well fed. They've been fed grain as a creep diet, and their mothers have also been fed grain. So they've grown very quickly, and they're nice, perfect for this market. Here's just a picture of these lambs during their rearing period. You can see, they all have really nice body condition. They're growing very quickly, and they're kind of ideal for this milk-fed market. Here's a picture of some of these lambs. These are slightly larger lambs here that are more for the Orthodox market that we sell. And they're also, for their size, their degree of maturity, they're also fairly well finished. They have a nice even fat cover. And this all has to do with them receiving a creep diet and their mothers milking very well. So here's just some work I've done for other purposes where it shows the body fatness that's in the carcass. So this would be body fatness in the carcass, or percent of the empty body. And it shows what that looks like at different body weights. And so it shows basically two things: the effective maturity here. So as the lambs become more mature and they're older and they're a greater percent of their mature size. So these sheep here, their mature size is about 60 kilos. So these are only like a third of their mature size here. So they'll continue to get much fatter. But you can see when we feed these lambs to grow fast, like 335 grams per day, or we restrict them to grow slow, we see a very different degree of body fatness. Now they become fatter, right, as they mature, of course, but also with that, their plane of nutrition makes a big difference. So growing these lambs quickly gives you this extra fatness, which translates into greater product quality. This is probably intuitive to most of you, but I just thought I'd show you this experiment that illustrates that concept very nicely. Okay. So the other category, I talked about milk-fed lambs. Another category are lambs that we sell for what I'm going to call halal slaughter for the Muslim market. This is a pretty broad category. Our most common optimal weight is sort of 40 to 45 kilos for these lambs, but it's a fairly broad category.
Richard, would you like me to give you some few answers of the questions, the question you asked? So in majority, people are answering 2. I can see a little bit of 3. And then if we look at the provincial level, less than 10% will be milk. About 40% will be what we call light lambs. So under 80, wait, I have a blank, 80, less than 80 pounds. And then we have a 50% will be sold between 20 kilos to 25 kilos on a carcass basis.
Okay. Yeah, that helps me. That's great. Yeah. So you don't sell, it's kind of similar to us. I think we consider our milk-fed lambs more of a specialty market, and it's a minor component. But for people who have the right type of production system, it can be an attractive market, but it's not the primary market. That's what I'm understanding, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have, yeah, that's very similar. So yeah, that's good for me to understand. So this category I'm talking now appears to be your primary market, and it really is for us especially in this part of the United States. So these are sold post-weaning. The standard for fatness for these lambs is not as high. You can have them a little bit more lean. In general, these lambs are also sold at a lower degree of maturity. So they're definitely going to be lean compared to the larger lambs, of course. And And so you can grow these more slowly if you want, if that fits your production system for whatever reason. And you can still meet the market preference standards because they're not going to necessarily be compromised in quality. Here's just a picture of this market. This is a typical lamb. This is a picture I took in downtown Detroit. And we have, large Muslim population. It's our primary market in Michigan and the upper Midwest would be, these large in the larger cities. This is a retail market here. I know this family pretty well. And here's just a picture of one of these lambs. It's probably, a 40 kilogram live weight lamb, sort of 20, 21 kilogram carcass. And you can see the color, it's this lighter color, it's young, it has a nice even fat cover. It's not excessively fat. And most of these lambs, again, are sold either sometimes as primal cuts, as whole carcasses, and not necessarily broken down extensively. So then for the traditional market, which probably is not of great interest to you, but I'll just describe it quickly. These are lambs that we grow to larger sizes. They're greater fatness. And generally, in this case, we recommend that people do not grow them to greater than 70% of maturity. Unfortunately, that rule is often broken and people get them too fat. But we find that at 70% of maturity, they average about 25% carcass fatness. That's more fat than you would typically see in the Muslim ethnic lambs, but it's still not like excessive. So that's kind of the standard that we look for. And then we adjust this maturity based on whether they're males or the rate of growth. So if you grow them as intact males, you can grow them to a greater degree of maturity because they have testosterone, they partition nutrients differently, and they tend to remain relatively lean. So we can grow them to a greater size, which probably is intuitive to you. Then we can also grow lambs to a larger size and not have them get excessively fat if we grow them a little more slowly. We call this sometimes backgrounding of lambs, simply just a term used for growing them a little more slowly. If you grow them more slowly, you can grow them to a larger carcass weight. And in some cases, that can be advantageous. The other reason I'll describe later is that they are fairly more feed efficient if they're grown slowly and then finished at the end. And that's a concept called compensatory gain. So I thought I'd review a little bit about lamb growth here, just so we're all on the same page. We all know that animals, partition nutrients so that fat has a lower priority. So animals, as they grow, they deposit fat as they become more mature. And so body composition really is a function of maturity, sex, and growth rate. So the degree of maturity, the rate at which they grow, and whether they're, have testosterone essentially or not, are the primary factors. So lambs with a larger mature size, like bigger breeds, are always going to be leaner at a given body weight than those with smaller maturity. And another thing that, at least in the United States, isn't often recognized is that body composition of animals is very similar when you compare them at the same degree of maturity. So that's just a principle I wanted to make clear. Perhaps you already understand it, but that's just a basic principle here. And I'll describe that in just a minute, a little bit more thoroughly. So the effects of sex on growth and composition of gain in lambs kind of looks like this. We see that rams naturally go faster than wethers or ewes. The feed to gain, right along with that, they're more efficient. So they have greater efficiency because they're depositing more calories into lean, which is more efficient than fat. They have slightly greater carcass weights. They accrete protein because of the anabolic effect of testosterone at a higher rate, and they accrete less fat. So they're depositing less fat. So they have advantages. The key thing, of course, is to take advantage of testosterone without having it affect meat quality, right? So generally, as a general rule, and you may have some ideas about this to share with me. But we feel that meat quality and tenderness do become compromised, but not until these males are probably around 7 months of age. They've reached sexual maturity, they're active. That's when we start to see problems with that. But if we market them before that, we can market them as intact males. So marketing males intact less than 5 months of age is generally going to be a great thing to do because you get this advantage of growth and feed efficiency. However, if you grow them to a greater size, they tend to, it might make sense to do some castration because, or rear them separately because they, especially if they're with their ewe lambs in a penning situation. I'm curious, do you producers in Quebec, do you ever castrate males? And if you do, is there like a kind of a cutoff for, what age you sell those lambs? Do you ever, I guess the first question is, do you castrate? And if you do, why, I guess? Is it because you're selling older lambs? And is there sort of a cutoff? Do you use this, 6 or 7 month cutoff as a criteria like I'm suggesting? So if you want to ask them that, I'll just keep talking and then you can kind of give me a little feedback on that. That'd be interesting.
Richard, we've had few answers. So the majority of people are saying no. Some people say they separate males and females at weaning.
Okay.
And yeah, that's about it. I've had a question in the Q&A box, if you want to answer it right now, from Jean-Philippe. Does the price is based on the fat? In other words, is there a percentage where the price is lower because you have too much fat? I think he's talking about your market, your American market.
Yeah, so how to answer that simply. There is not, for the lighter lambs, we want them basically as fat as possible. They generally don't have a fatness problem when they're sold in this lighter weight category, right? But for the older lambs, you do get a bit of a reduction if they're very fat. However, unfortunately, it's not that much. And that's a problem with our markets, is that we don't really pay on body composition like we should. So we don't really have big penalties for getting lambs super fat. And that is probably the primary problem of the large lamb market in the United States. So we don't get the kind of deficits that we should. So we it's a self-perpetuating problem. Then we produce more of these fat lambs. So that's something our industry is working on. They're actually using what we call camera grading systems. They've got from Europe, they've adopted some of these camera systems where they can predict carcass yield and fatness from pictures of the lambs online. And so they're starting to use those in some of the larger processing plants in the West Coast of the United States. And that's showing to show a lot of promise. It's just, but still, it's an issue that we deal with.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I think you answered the question.
Yeah, so lamb growth concepts. So maturity is going to affect growth rate, of course. It's going to affect body composition and feed efficiency. And I'll just give you like a hypothetical here. So if we compare two different breeds that we have, a smaller breed would be the Polypay versus a Suffolk, which is a larger breed. The mature size of these animals, and this is the size of the ewes I'm describing, are pretty different. Like this is a very, very big sheep, and this is like still a pretty good size, but not nearly as big. So if we look at a 59 kilo lamb and compare it, it's much more mature, obviously, if it's a Polypay than a Suffolk. So what we find is that the muscle is similar, the bone is similar, the fat is much greater. But if we compare these animals at the same degree of maturity, what we find is that the live weight is going to be very different. So these lambs can be grown to a much larger size, okay? Their muscle is going to be equivalent on a percentage basis. Their bone's going to be equivalent on a percentage basis, as is their fat. So if you compare them, I guess my point here is to make it more clear. If we compare them at the same degree of maturity, these breeds that are very different in mature size will have, very similar body composition. However, if we compare them at the same weight, oops, for some reason my animation's not working right. We see big differences in body fatness, okay? So feed efficiency is influenced by diet, maturity, and genetics. And we can have very efficient animals. We can have lambs growing with like 3 pounds or 3 kilos of feed per kilo of gain, but it can be as poor as 8 or 9 if they're, growing, if they're allowed to gain excessive fat. So the lean growth phase, where they accumulate muscle, of course, is the most efficient. And obviously, you would recognize that there's a lot more water and less energy in a pound of muscle than a pound of fat. That's why on a weight basis, it seems more efficient, and it is more efficient on a mass basis. So lamb feed efficiency is really driven by the composition of gain, by how fat they are, and that's in turn hugely influenced by maturity. So here's an example here where I have the feed to gain, it doesn't need units, it's a ratio shown here as a function of maturity. So as animals become more mature, their feed to gain goes down, and it's perfectly explained largely by their body fatness. So as they gain, body fatness, their efficiency goes way down. And here's what it looks like. So most of the lambs that you guys are selling and that we're selling to our ethnic markets are probably somewhere in this range. They're still in a good degree of efficiency. Their efficiency is not quite as great as maybe when they were very first weaned, but they're still pretty efficient. But we see a large decrease in feed efficiency, increase in feed to gain here as they get above about 70% maturity. That's why we don't suggest people feed lambs past 70% unless they're intact males and so forth, because look how much this tips off. If I took this to 1, they would be way, way up here somewhere. It's like, it's an exponential increase in feed to gain, or much worse feed efficiency. So, of course, fat is a lower priority for energy than does muscle. So when animals are fed excess energy, the relative partitioning into fat is going to be greater, right? So therefore, animals growing more slowly are leaner. And again, backgrounding is this term where we grow them a little bit more slowly, allowing for a leaner animal later on, okay? So this, when we look at partitioning of nutrients in any really animals, and this would be ruminants primarily here, and this was articulated by people many years ago. This is from John Hammond, who is from the United Kingdom, who did a lot of the early work on understanding the relationship between the partitioning of nutrients within the body and their relative priority. So what he's showing here is that partitioning is the relative priority is shown by arrows here. So fat has the lowest priority. So if you have lambs that are being fed like a lower calorie diet, and maybe they need greater energy expenditure because they're cold or they have to graze in cold weather, which I'll talk about later, we see that that's, sucks some of the nutrients that they need and doesn't allow for as much fattening. So, those are things to consider here when we finish lambs. And of course, in terms of lamb finishing, what we're looking for is to have adequate marbling or intramuscular fat without excessive fat on the outside of the carcass. Generally, people are looking for an intramuscular or marbling fat content of about 4%, 4 to 5%. If it's less than that, it tends to be less juicy. So our goal is to provide some of this marbling without too much seam fat. Okay. So background feeding systems can be used to create larger market animals that are still relatively lean, and it can be a good or bad strategy. It depends on the market price. Some people in our part of the world will do backgrounding because lambs will tend to reach a premium later in the market cycle, so they want to slow down their growth. They hit those what do you want to call them? Premium time periods of the year. And it can be a good or bad strategy depending on the impact of maturity on carcass quality. Generally, lamb quality is still pretty good as long as the lambs are less than a year of age. There isn't like a huge impact on that. And then the yardage cost. Yardage cost is just defined as the cost of maintaining an animal in a feeding facility. If that's very high, backgrounding these lambs isn't going to be a good idea. And then mortality risk. Obviously, if you grow lambs more slowly, they're on earth longer, there's a greater risk of them dying the longer they're around. So that becomes so mortality risk goes up a little bit higher. And then what is the cost of gain for background finishing versus feeding for fast growth? That's also a big factor. So I'll talk about that as we move along here. Okay. So here's a system that we've used in some of our research. We've had lambs that we've put on a diet like this. This happens to be some annual forage. This is a forage rape crop that we've grown, and we've grazed lambs, and these lambs actually gain fairly well, but they don't gain as well as they do on grain, but it gives us this kind of backgrounding diet. Here's another example of some of these forages that we grow. We sometimes use these in a pasture-based system in combination with perennial pasture. So these are some annual forages. They have higher quality than most perennial systems, and they can be part of a pasture rotation that we use. This happens to be a combination of forage rape, Chinese cabbage, and some, this would be Sudan grass, a certain hybrid of Sudan grass. Here's another example how we grow these sometimes in strips, and these can all be good background finishing diets. And this can have monetary advantages, and you can also use permanent pasture if it's done properly. But the challenges with grazing lambs, of course, are, there's predation issues, which you're probably well aware of. Parasite control is much more challenging in these situations, especially when lambs are, immunologically less resistant to infection. So we have to use more anthelmintics, more dewormers. It's a challenge to control that. And it's also a challenge to have adequate energy in these grazing forages. So that's often in how they're managed on grazing situations makes a big difference, and the type of forages that we graze. And then the other problem with grazing lambs is just, do we have pastures available? I would imagine you probably have more of an issue with this even than we do, but we're in similar climates where, basically in many production systems, when you want to have the extra pasture to graze lambs, you simply wouldn't have it because it's at the time of year when forage growth is starting to slow later in the season. And so that can be a little bit of an issue. So you have to sometimes create these grazing opportunities. And as far as grazing management goes, we'd want to maximize the intake of these lambs on pasture, and that becomes a matter of grazing management. And we want to make sure that we, we consider whether we're maximizing the individual gain or the gain per acre. So if you're finishing lambs on pasture, and we have people who are interested in this, we get some premiums for grass finished lambs. And so this is a relatively minor market, but if you're doing this market, you really want to get maximum individual gains so the lambs become as fat as possible, because that's often a limiting factor. But if you're background finishing them, you're more interested in maximizing the gain per acre. So we might adjust the stocking rates of how we graze these lambs so we maximize gain per acre. And if you are interested in the maximum performance of individual lambs, you need to make sure we have shorter grazing bouts. We limit the allowance to allow greater selectivity of grazing. Here's just some different gains that we see in different grazing systems compared to grain. So this right here is the grain system. When we feed them unlimited grain, this is just an example of some work that I've done at the university where we're looking at a certain type of sheep, growing them right about this degree of maturity. So this would probably be about the maturity that you market most of your lambs at. But at that, when we feed them grain, we get high performance. We also get reasonably good performance of pasture-fed lambs in the summertime when we feed them these diets. And it's basically based on the energy content of the forage and also the season. So we see like two effects here. We basically see that lambs in the summertime, when it's warm, we get higher growth rates. And when they're fed better quality forages, like a leafy brassica forage, and maybe red clover ryegrass as compared to the Sudan mix, which is still good, but not quite as good as these two. So you see the performance is pretty high here. And then in the fall, when we graze lambs during the colder weather, things start to change a little bit. We get reasonably good gains here with high quality forages in the early fall. But then if we push these lambs to gain with kind of like the picture I'm showing behind my back here, during the late fall, early winter, we see a decline in gain. And I guess this shouldn't be a surprise, but that has largely to do with the fact that it's cold outside. The forage quality is still very high, but these lambs have to spend more energy grazing and withstanding cold temperatures. So their gains drop down and they're not nearly as good. So the pattern, the fact that in most of our grazing systems, we see deficits depending on, these are two different types of pastures here, and these are the forage growth patterns over time. We see a deficit in forage always in the fall. And of course, that's the challenge. We don't have a lot of forage available in many of our systems to handle this. So what some people will do is they'll plant some high energy forages, which I showed you pictures of before, to kind of fill this gap. It could be brassicas, people even graze standing corn, and then they have some specialty pastures that they use. And here's just an example of one of these systems where someone might have a farm. They'll put a certain percentage of their land, and here's a bunch of different fields that they might have. They'll put a certain percentage of their land in from like hay or pasture ground into specialty pastures that might have clover and forbs or even some perennial forage like I showed you pictures of. And these are fields that you can graze late in the season that are low in parasites and have very high quality. You can use for some of these background finishing systems. So by kind of having a certain percentage of your pastures in this, so during year one, for example, any particular year, let's say you have, I have 8 different pastures here. You might have a third or 3 of the 8, not quite a third, in annual forages or some higher quality forage. And you rotate that year by year. So this is basically like a pasture or forage improvement system that allows you some grazing opportunities of higher quality forage. The other option that we have is that we grow a lot of cover crops in this part of the United States. And I guess I'm curious to know if you grow cover crops in Quebec. I'm sure you do. And if you ever graze those with sheep. So if that's a question we could ask the audience, I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And so what I'll do is I'll describe a little bit about these cover crop grazing opportunities. So as you probably know, cover crops are grown as crops after the primary crop is harvested. And for example, in this part of the United States, we grow a lot of winter wheat that's harvested in like mid to late summer. And then the ground is kind of left fallow until the next spring. So we often will plant a cover crop during that time. And so crop farmers are planting these because they help retain soil nutrients, they control erosion, they enhance residue recycling, they sequester more carbon into the soil. They do a lot of really positive things for crop production. But they could also do some wonderful things for sheep production because there's a lot of these crops grown. There's a lot of potential, and it's very high quality forage because a lot of times these cover crops are brassica-like species that are very high in energy. They're parasite free, so that's one of the limits we have with pasture. And we can graze them pretty far into winter. Like the picture behind me shows an example of grazing some ewes on these crops. So I was interested, a number of people I work with also are interested in seeing if we can utilize grazing of these crops in a sheep production system and kind of evaluate their forage quality and see how that affects our cost of production. So we set up a study where we compared feeding animals our typical grain feedlot diet for 6 weeks. Okay, so this would be kind of our control, you could call it. We fed lambs a background feeding where we put them on this pasture shown here in the fall for 4 weeks, and we followed, so we slowed their growth for 4 weeks, and then we grew them on feedlot for 4 weeks. So this is one of our other treatments. Then we compared two different two different cover crops. We compared one cover crop that was primarily brassica, a lot of brassica content, and then we compared it to another cover crop that was more of a mixture. Still had a lot of brassica in it, but it had other warm season forages as well. So, you know, we replicated this properly. We had 3 replicates of pasture. We had these long strips that we grazed. So all these lambs were born kind of late spring, early summer. And we put them on this study in early October when they were, you know, larger probably than your typical lambs, but that's, we put them on about 41 kilos. So we looked at that growth during their, you know, later finishing phase. We used different breeds each year. So we did this for 3 years. I'm only showing 2 years of data, even though I'm describing 3. I don't have the 3rd year of data in this study in these results, but it's very consistent with the first 2 years. We use mostly castrated males because we're marketing them at older ages, and mostly polypay times Dorset lambs. We had a few different breeds, but we balanced these over our treatments. The mixtures that we compared were a little bit different from year to year, but our brassica mix was mostly forage rape, purple top turnips, and radish. And then our more diverse mix had these components as well, but had a bunch of warm season annuals, including pearl millet, Japanese millet, some clover, some field peas, and some oats. Excuse me. Pretty much the same between both years. And we just measured growth performance of these lambs. We weighed them on pasture, and we collected blood samples and looked at lots of different health parameters too. One of the issues with grazing lambs on brassica pasture that's been shown in other parts of the world is that, or actually anywhere in the world, is that sometimes they cause a type of anemia that can be problematic. So we monitored that. And I'm not going to show you those results, but we didn't have any issues with lambs becoming anemic. So that was not an issue. So the feedlot lambs, we transitioned them carefully using high energy fiber sources like soy hull feed. And the grazing lambs, there's just a picture of the feedlot lambs. The grazing lambs were grazed for 1 week periods on average. Excuse me. We measured the amount of forage that's available each week, and we gave them the same allotment, the same mass of forage each week. So the paddock, the pasture size was determined by the amount of forage that we measured. So we always gave them about 10% of the pens. We had like about 5 animals per pen of the pen's body weight. So on a daily basis. So they were given essentially 10% of their body weight in forage dry matter. Then we had them slaughtered about 6 weeks for the grain treatment, so more quickly, because they're growing more quickly. 8 weeks for the background treatment and for the pasture treatments. So the lambs were, killed pretty quickly after the last weight measurement. And what we did is we looked at aspects of carcass quality, which I'm showing you here. Here's one of the lambs. So at the 12th rib, we looked at the eye muscle depth, the loin the area of the longissimus dorsi muscle, the depth of fat. That's actually not, arrow isn't showing quite right. And then we also did this body wall depth measurement. So those are the basic carcass standards or measurements that we're able to do. We also analyzed the meat. We collected the loins from these lambs. And it sounds kind of funny to you. I don't know if you know who George Foreman is, but there's a grill. He used to be an American heavyweight fighter in the 70s and 80s. If you're my age, you probably heard of him. Well, he, in his later years after he retired from boxing, decided to create a grill. And for some reason in meat science, we use these grills, the old George Foreman grill, to do our cooking. So it's kind of a funny thing. Anyhow, so we used this George Foreman grill. We cooked them to a certain internal temperature. And then we measured shear force. We looked at the color. So we did a physical measurement of tenderness. We did a measurement of color. And then we also analyzed them for protein, moisture, and fat. So those are some chemical analyses we did. And in addition, we cooked the meat and we presented it to a consumer panel. And we asked this consumer panel to score the meat based on how much they liked it, their flavor, their tenderness, and their overall acceptability. And so basically, each person on the panel got tasted lamb loin chops from each treatment. Excuse me. So I'll get back to that. So here's our results. So our botanical composition of our treatments looks like this. I think you can see that. Yeah. So the brassica only diet was primarily brassica, but I should tell you that the mixture, and it didn't change much over time. So here's the time of the study. It was like 90%, 95% brassica, just a small amount of other stuff in it. Like in most, the other stuff would have been volunteer wheat primarily, because this was a wheat field before that. The mixture, however, was also maybe not as much warm season grass as we would have liked. Still had a lot of brassica in it, but it did have other plants in it as well. In their third year of the study, which I don't have the data here, this was a greater percentage. So this varies a lot from year to year. The growing conditions in 1 year might favor more warm season germination versus brassica germination. So this can vary. That's one of the advantages of a mixture. But as you'll see, this amount of warm season grass primarily did impact, or grass in general did impact the quality and lowered the quality a bit. We also looked at the proportion of herbage, which is just leafy material, versus tubers. And we can see that it was, a little bit more tubers here in the brassica, but still most of it's herbage. And then here's the gain. This is probably the important thing to show you, is this is comparing the gain over time. So these are different points of the treatment. And here's the different treatments. So grain here is shown in yellow. Brassica only is this this lighter green color. The background treatment is this darker green color. And then the mixture is this pink color. So you can see here that the grain-fed lambs obviously grew faster during the whole period, but they did slow down in growth during their right before slaughter, and their feed efficiency went down a little bit too. The pasture-based lambs grew about half the rate, maybe a little bit more than half the rate of the grain-fed lambs. And they maintained this growth rate pretty consistently, but then it did start to decline, as you can see here towards the end of the study. And we feel this especially near the very end. And this was when it was cold out. So again, the study started early October. This is late October. This would be November. And this is late November, very early December. So during this period, it gets pretty cold and the growth rate goes down. The important one to talk about here, though, is this background treatment. So these lambs were on pasture, and then we put them on a grain diet here after 4 weeks. As soon as we put them on a grain diet, obviously they're growing much more quickly. We can adjust them to this grain diet very fast because we use high energy fiber feeds to get them on grain immediately. So they transition very quickly. And then they actually achieve the highest growth rate of any group during this period. And this is often called compensatory gain. So they achieve a higher growth rate than if they were continuously fed grain, and they have greater feed efficiency as well, as I'll show you in a second. So we look at the gain per acre or gain per hectare, kilos per hectare, however you want to express it, gain per unit land. We see that in these treatments, it's a little higher earlier in the season when it's warmer, and then the gains per unit land go down. And this has two components. It's because it's cold out, and also the forage quality is deteriorating just a little bit, and the amount available is deteriorating just a little bit. If we look at the intake and feed efficiency, it looks something like this. So I'm looking at the intake here expressed as dry matter intake, sorry for the acronym. And we can see that the grain-fed lambs and the background lambs are eating about 3.5% of their body weight, which is pretty much what we'd predict. But the intake per unit gain is a little bit, so these animals are a little bit more efficient, as you can see here. So these are more efficient. These are around 4, and these guys are more like 6. So during this background feeding phase, they actually have greater feed efficiency. And that's pretty important, because if we have greater feed efficiency, we're going to have less expensive gain, right? And so that becomes an important thing to consider in all of this. So we look at the carcass weights, we can see pretty clearly that the grain-fed and background lambs are a little bigger. Even though we grew these longer, they didn't achieve the same size. So these grain-fed lambs are larger than the pasture lambs. The fatness is a little bit greater as well than the pasture lambs. The body wall fatness is greater. So these are no big surprises, right? Loin-eye area is a little bit bigger, so they're a little bit more muscle, and that held with the fat depth as well. We have something we call yield grade. So the higher the yield grade, the fatter the animal is. So this is just explaining that. We consider a yield grade of 2 to be acceptable. So these lambs were acceptable carcasses. They had adequate finish. They were relatively lean. They would fit your ethnic market really well and our ethnic market really well, but they're maybe just a little on the lean side for our larger lamb market. Interesting, our dressing percentage was very similar. We expected these pasture lambs to have lower dressing percentage, but actually there was no difference between those and grain-fed lambs. So that was kind of interesting to us. As far as the meat physical and chemical analysis of these treatments, we saw some differences here. We had a little bit greater cooking loss in the grain-fed lambs because they're a little bit fatter. And this is something we saw without a doubt, is that the red color of the meat was much more pronounced in the pasture lambs. Even the lambs that were on the background diet, they had received pasture for a 4-week period followed by 4 weeks of grain. That red color was largely maintained in these pasture lambs 4 weeks after taking them off pasture. I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know exactly what it means, but it is a factor. This redness was much lighter in the grain-fed lambs, and that was really clear. When we looked at these lambs in the slaughterhouse, we could see it with our own eyes, but these are actually measured chemically. We also saw that the color was lighter in the grain-fed lambs, so these were more red and lighter colored, and we saw pretty big differences again. So I guess these are the main things. Oh, the other thing, I'm sorry, The other thing I wanted to mention, which is kind of important, is that the fatness of the muscle, this is the fat within the muscle, was the same. This surprised me. I expected that these lambs that have less fat outside of their body subcutaneously, which I showed you earlier, would also have less fat within the muscle, but that was not the case. So the eating quality of these lambs based on this chemical composition should be very good. They have adequate fat marbling within the muscle, and they should have very, juicy, flavorful chops. And this kind of surprised me. I expected it to be lower. Numerically, it's lower, but statistically, it wasn't. So then we can do all this chemical analysis, but those are just predictors of what the eating experience is going to be. So we actually fed these chops, as I mentioned, to a consumer panel and asked them what they preferred. And they had them rank them on a scale of 1 to 100. So if they really, really like this stuff, they gave us a high score of closer to 100. And if they didn't like it, they give us a 0. So you see that overall, they liked lamb pretty well, which is good. The other thing I should mention is this consumer panel are consumers that have had lamb before. So it's important, when you develop a consumer panel, you understand what their eating experience is. You might get different results if they've never tried lamb. In our part of the world, in the United States, a lot of people have never tried lamb. So we might get different results if we put on a consumer panel who's never tasted lamb before. But this consumer panel were lamb consumers. And interestingly, we saw that they preferred, of all things, this brassica treatment. This surprised us, and I'll explain that a little bit better. This surprised us because one of the reasons why we did this whole consumer panel is that there was a perception that if you graze lambs on brassicas, on these turnips, on radishes, and things like that, that some of the flavor, there'll be an off flavor in their meat, and that the consumer might taste that and might not prefer that. What we found actually, interestingly, was the opposite. And it wasn't like a huge preference, but it was statistically significant. They actually favored this treatment, which was a big surprise to us. They also perceived them to be more juicy, which was a surprise as well. And this is compared to grain-fed lambs. And also, so those were the two big differences, flavor and juiciness. And it isn't statistically significant here, but you can see that they tended to favor this brassica treatment over the others. I should add, though, that they pretty much like all of the lamb, but they had slight preference for this lamb. So that was interesting. Then the final thing I wanted to talk about is the cost of gain of these systems. So this is the final slide. And what we did is we calculated the cost of gain, which is the amount of money it takes to finish these lambs per kilo of gain. And what we found is that for the grain lambs, we have the highest cost of gain. And I translated this all into Canadian money, which is a little bit of a challenge, and into kilos, but I think I did it properly. And because I had it expressed differently, obviously, for a different audience. But you can see that the cost of gain is greater in grain-fed lambs, not a lot, but significantly different. The background lambs are kind of intermediate, and the pasture lambs are cheaper. Now, the pasture cost has a lot of components to it. It has to do with, the yield of the pasture, the labor it takes to move animals on pasture. I put all of those things into this analysis, but you can see that cost of gain is cheaper. However, the returns over the feeding period I'm expressing here. And this, you have to remember that these pasture lambs didn't grow to be as big. So their actual returns, even though they had cheaper gain, their total return, because they didn't get as big, is not, it's not really showing up here. But we did find that the greatest returns we got were for the background lambs. The reason why they were better than grain-fed lambs is because they had greater feed efficiency and a little bit cheaper cost of gain, okay? So that had some advantages, a significant advantage in our system. And the returns of the pasture lambs were similar. This is assuming that they're all getting the same price. Like if you got a premium for pasture lambs, this might look different. Or if you got a premium for grain lambs, it might look different. We're just assuming that they all got the same price, and that's what we got. So this shows the returns are greater for these background lambs and that the cost of gain is cheaper for the pasture lambs. So I'll just summarize this. Lambs on grain diets grew faster and had greater carcass weight and fatness than those that were grazing. No big surprise. Lambs on the background system had compensatory growth and improved feed efficiency. So that's why they had a little bit less expensive gain. All the lambs had acceptable fatness, even though they were a little bit different. The loin chops that we looked at were darker color and a deeper red color. The intramuscular fat, the marbling, was in an acceptable range, and it did not differ between our treatments. And our consumer analysis showed a preference for these lambs grazing brassica cover crop, but it wasn't a huge preference, but it was there, and it did show up. The cost of gain was similar in our pasture reared and background lambs, but the total profit over the finishing period was greater for background lambs. So that's pretty much what I have. I'm glad to take any questions you have. And here's just a number of the people who helped with the project. And here's my contact information. So why don't I put the conclusion slide back up, and glad to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. So just before we pass through some questions, I just wanted to let you know that a few people had written in the chat about cover crops. And some of the answers, people are doing the cover crops, but mostly one of the producers is saying he's not have the same performances as you. And yeah, that's about it. But I don't think many of the producers are feeding their lambs on pasture.
Yeah.
So we've had 2 questions regarding the maturity degree. So let me just translate it. So one of the question is the degree of maturity is the age. Does it mean it's the age of the animal?
No, I should explain that. When I talk about maturity, I'm talking about it in terms of size. So when I talk about degree of maturity, it's related to the size of the lamb. So if they grow, so yeah.
Okay. So how do you determine the maturity level of a lamb when you don't know, when you don't know where he comes from? So I guess it's his race, or how do you determine, the degree of the lamb?
Yeah, that's hard to know. I think, most of us know it's hard to do that, right? On the other hand, when I see lambs at a market, you can tell based on the breeds that, just looking at them, you can predict their genetic background fairly well and their associated size potential or their maturity potential based on that. You're going to make some mistakes, but I think just looking at them and understanding the breeds that are in your part of the world, and their mature size, you can get some pretty good predictions of whether they're from, large mature size breeds or small mature size breeds.
Okay. A question from Francois. What kind of ADG are you expecting on a perennial pasture, legume and grass mix?
Yeah, let me go back here just a little bit. I think sorry, it's a little cumbersome here. Maybe I'll take it out of this presentation mode. Yep. Here, can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So the best comparison, this right here is probably the very best we would see. generally on perennial, this is a specialty pasture. So this is not perennial pasture. Some people can see gains close to this in perennial pasture, but more typically we're seeing gains more like 200 grams. So they're not going to be as great because this pasture is a high percentage of red clover and very high quality ryegrass. And so it tends to be about as good as you can see. So this would be kind of the upper limit on pasture. And more typically, the pastures that I don't have that information here, but I can remember pretty well that our perennial pastures are going to be more like that 180 to 200 grams per day range. But if they're carefully managed and they've got a lot of legume content, we might get up to this range on perennial pasture.
Okay.
So it's pretty variable, and it has a lot to do with how you manage the pasture. The quality sometimes is there, but you have to manage the grazing appropriately to get the best gains. So it's, it's not just forage quality.
Okay. Since we're seeing pasture species on your PowerPoint, we have a question about sudden grass. So
Okay.
Denise is asking, are you aware of a toxicity problem with prussic acid in sudden grass on pasture?
I'm aware of it. Yeah, prussic acid is generally a problem after the plants die, like during a frost period. And even then, my experience, I've had a fair bit of experience grazing Sudan grass. This is a Sudan, it's called brown midrib. It's a hybrid, or not hybrid, it's actually transgenic plant. Like they introduced this brown midrib gene, which actually makes it more digestible. So this particular type of Sudan grass, this BMR Sudan, it doesn't have a lot of prussic acid. Even after a frost, we've grazed this without any problems. And the actual sorghum, which is a similar plant, right? Mm-hmm. Sorghum has higher prussic acid. So I feel more confident saying these hybrid Sudan grasses, the BMR Sudans, their prussic acid content's fairly low. And I've never had a problem with prussic acid poisoning, even grazing it after freezing. But I'd be more cautious with sorghum. And, I'd still be a little concerned about it, but it is not an issue unless it's after a frost. And even then, it's pretty low for this particular type of Sudan grass.
Okay, thank you. So we'll stay in species. At what stage of growth of brassica is pastured?
Yeah, sorry, I should have pictures of that. But yeah, I didn't describe that very well. So we grazed these when we had about 2.3 metric tons per hectare is when we started grazing them. So the brassica, the bulbs, for example, of the turnips would have been sort of, well, let me think, maybe 10 centimeters. They weren't real big yet. And the forage rape was probably, close to half a meter tall. And so they were planted in early August. So we grazed them about 50 to 60 days after planting, if that helps. And so, yeah, and then we continued to graze them, and they continued to grow even as we were grazing them they grew well into November. They stopped growing about November. And then their quality declines a little bit, but not too much.
Okay. Another question from Jean-Philippe. I would like to know if Richard thinks the same results can be expected in Quebec, where the weather is colder than in Michigan. What would expect in a colder? What would we expect in a colder weather?
Yeah, so it's not that much colder than Michigan. I appreciate what you're saying. I'm joking. It certainly is a little cold. So let me pull up this slide. So
just to let you know, today I think it's -17, but in Quebec City.
okay, yeah, no, I understand it's cold, and our climates are a little bit different, but not dramatically. You have a shorter growing season, I'm sure, but not huge. If you go to northern Michigan, it's probably very similar. We have a big difference between like southern Michigan and northern Michigan. But I would suggest that probably in your climate, it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks different, right? So I would say that you probably will start seeing like poor lamb performance during the month of right about early November, mid-November. When it gets to be consistently frozen ground, you're going to see them performance more like this. So this was late. This was like the 3rd week of November here, and we saw a pretty big change right then. So your performance, I would say, would be the same and until that period of time. So that might be early November for you and late November for us would be my guess. So okay. I think there is some potential, but I want to add though, that even with this lower growth, these are the lambs that people liked. It didn't, it surprised me. It didn't really affect their meat quality. It did affect their performance though. Yeah.
So do you think consumers would prefer forage lambs?
I don't want
grain lambs?
No, I don't want to. No. Like, I don't want to. Look, we found that in our work, right? It's pretty obvious, and I can't deny that. But I would, yeah. So, I don't want to overstate that. Okay, so they liked all these lambs pretty well. I would say it more like this. I would say they didn't dislike the forage lambs. I don't think it makes a real big difference. And it would be good to repeat this work, but it was interesting. This was clearly superior. And and again, it might depend on the consumer palate, right? And different people, we're all different in how we perceive taste. And maybe for this particular consumer, we don't have demographics on these consumers. I can't tell you if they're, what their, background is exactly, but they did. The only thing I can tell you is that they ate lamb before. So I don't know if that means they're like, people from Middle Eastern part of the world originally or what. I don't know that, but we do know that people who like lamb tend to like this stronger flavored lamb,
Okay.
And yeah, so.
I think it's the last question concerning pasture. So what price can you expect for grass-fed lambs in the US?
I can't answer that. There are some people who will pay a lot of money for grass-fed lambs, but it's not a really big, it's a specialty market, probably in a few urban areas. If I went to the grocery store in my small rural area, no one would pay a premium for it here. They pay a premium for grass-fed beef, but I can't answer how much more they pay for grass-fed lamb. I'm sure they would be willing with the right marketing to pay more for it, but I can't give you a concrete answer to that.
Okay. So we'll switch the topic a little bit. But it's still about finishing lambs. So we have a question from Francois. Have you ever done tests with corn silage?
No, we haven't. Yeah, I guess that's what I'd say. I think corn silage, you would expect, I would expect to have, it's lower energy than pure grain, but it would probably, I'm trying to find a slide here. I would expect we'd see gains, in the 300, 350. It could be a pretty good feed. Have you guys looked at gains on corn silage? Have you used it in finishing rations?
I would not have the ADG number for you, but I know some people use it, yes.
Yeah, I think it could be a good system because you can have a pretty inexpensive diet, right? And
maybe we could ask our audience if people are using corn silage. What are your daily gain for your lambs? That would be interesting.
I actually, now I can't remember all the things I've done. I have looked at that question a little bit, and I don't have the answer exactly in my head, but we did see slightly lower cost of gain, but lower growth, and they were kind of offsetting, you know. So it wasn't a bad system, but it was sort of equivalent in terms of profit to our grain system. When we looked at that question, I did look at that once in a large farm. We compared like exclusive grain feeding to adding corn silage to a diet. And they were both good systems. It's just that they kind of had one of them had, grain had higher gain, but lower, and a little bit greater cost of gain. So the profit was similar.
Okay. A question from Pierre. Do you have any recent studies on feed efficiency versus processing corn, whole, crack, or flake, and barley? I know it's this question comes often.
No, it's a great question. Yeah, I haven't compared those diets. That'd be good to do some of that kind of work, but I haven't. You're asking like sort of energy processing of grains and how it might impact energy utilization and gain in lambs. And I don't have any data on that. I could speculate, but I don't have data on that. I know that, barley can certainly be an excellent sheep feed, and processing might make a small difference in starch utilization, but not as much as it will in cattle diets, because sheep can chew barley, right? They can grind it with their teeth. And so it has less of an impact than it does in cattle diets, that's for sure.
Because one of our question our team is asking ourselves is what's the percentage of forage our finishing lamb feeding system should have? Do you have an idea? Or
yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure if I've got a great answer for that. Well, I usually think about it in terms of like NDF content, nutrient fiber content. And I just give this broad recommendation. I said it has to be 15%, but I don't really know that. Like I can't really say that with great confidence. It's just that's my general recommendation.
okay.
So you want a little bit of fiber in your diet, but we have people who live in corn country, we call it, like Iowa, where if you ever drove through Iowa, all you see is cornfields. There's corn is the king. And people in that part of the world swear that they can feed lambs only corn, or basically no fiber, and they get good performance and good health. But I'm inclined to say that it's better if you have some fiber content, and I'd say 15% NDF would be right about what I'd recommend.
Okay. So actually, like lambs would seem to be ad libitum on grain if they have like 15% of forage.
Yeah.
Okay. I know someone raised his hand. Francois, would you like to talk? I could allow you the mic. Francois. I'll let him maybe write back to me. So we have another question. What grain were fed and how much per head? What was the percentage of protein do you aim for an accelerated growth?
Yeah, I didn't describe that. Apologize for that. I know the diet pretty well. Just see, I don't think I put that in there, did I? No, I omitted that. The grain diet we had was, it was probably 60% corn, about 25% soy hulls, which are a byproduct feed, and sort of 10% soybean meals. So I think the crude protein was about 14%, and the energy and TDN, which is probably not something you're familiar with necessarily, was around 80. I'm not sure how that computes, but it was a pretty high energy diet, but it did have a fair bit of fiber in it because the soy hulls have a high fiber content, but the soy hull fiber is very high energy fiber. So it's a pretty nice feed. We really like soy hulls. I don't know if you guys ever have soy hulls available to you in your part of the world, but they're an excellent sheep feed because they provide that fiber that you'd like to see a little bit in a finishing diet to help prevent acidosis. And they're still high energy because it's a very fermentable fiber in the rumen. Yeah.
Okay. Do the US sheep farmers produce enough lambs to supply US processors' actual demand?
No.
Okay. That was a direct answer. Perfect. Let me see. I'm trying to regroup the questions.
They want lambs to come from Canada, however, but that's a whole nother question.
Is it worthwhile to do ultrasound testing for grading purpose?
Oh, interesting question. So like if you were to like just do a scan of sheep and try to predict their back fat with ultrasound, is that the question you think?
I think maybe.
Is that your interpretation?
Yeah.
Well, certainly you can, what I'll try to answer, I would say I don't know for sure. Like I would think it doesn't have, it's pretty difficult to actually measure body fat with ultrasound. It's very, you can do it, but it's hard to be very quantitative. I found it's challenging. It is reasonable to measure the thickness of the eye muscle, like of the longissimus dorsi. You can measure the depth, right? And that can be very useful for genetic selection. People who use that measurement, like they use it in Australia, they use it in the United States, I'm sure they might use it in Canada too. We call it eye muscle depth. That is a pretty useful measurement. And then you can, take that on live animals. So if you've got a bunch of ram lambs, you can select those that have greater eye muscle depth. You will improve meat yield over time. So that if that's the question, that's useful. But for marketing, I don't think it's very useful to predict fat depth.
Okay. Do you know from other studies if a good marbling for grass-fed lambs could be expected from any breeds of sheep?
Great question. Don't know. We wish we knew that. Is there genetic differences in marbling, I guess? And probably there are. I think the Australians are studying that and learning that, and they're kind of ahead of a lot of us because they've got the capacity to do that. But yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that? Do you think you have some breeds that you think are superior in, like marble, like Angus cattle are, right? Do you have a breed of sheep that is better? Because I don't think we can identify one here.
I would have the same answer as you. So maybe maybe some people will write in the chat. Another question.
A lot of people have opinions on that, but
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of information.
Does the dark red color of the meat have a negative impact on the consumer? So do you know if consumers see a negative impact on the red color of the meat?
It's a great question. I don't know. What do you think? I think it's mixed. I think I'm not sure. Maybe a very educated lamb consumer looks at red meat and says, that's old and I don't want it. Maybe a less educated one says, that's a beautiful color. It's what I wanted. It's a good question. I wondered the same thing. Do you guys have any thoughts? Like, you guys in your part of the world, you probably consume a lot more lamb than the typical American does. Do you, when you go to the grocery store, do you look at the color?
I produce my own, so I don't look at the color. But
I don't really answer that. But these guys, the people who, well, they didn't get to see the color, right? They just saw the cooked product, but they certainly thought it was pretty good. Yeah.
Good.
I think, oh, I just would add, I think we have people who are used to grass-fed meat and prefer it do look for that color. So I would argue that, yeah, it could be a selling point if you're selling to that type of consumer, because I think they associate that grass, greater keratin content. Well, I don't know if that's really the case, but they perceive that it's more nutritious. So there is a perception, and I think there is a slight demand for it with that consumer. Yeah.
Okay. I think someone wanted to answer a question about marbling, but the person is saying only the butcher could tell the marbling, but then the lamb has no wool by then. Trying to understand all that, but yeah. We're going back to a question about brassica. Do you think that anemia problem is related to the number of weeks on brassica, or age related, or it's age related?
That's a great question. The anemia issue is apparently they develop anemia often very fast. So it's possible, and we wondered this a little bit, if they develop anemia immediately and then it kind of disappears. We weren't able to answer that in the first 2 years of our project because we didn't look at it before 4 weeks on study. We did this year, and we didn't see an impact of it. So other people have shown that, yeah, for our brassica species. So one thing I should add is there's a particular secondary plant compound that causes it's associated with anemia with brassica feeding. And I can't remember the exact pronunciation of it. The acronym is SM, sulfoxyl methyl. I can't remember the compound, but SMCO is what the acronym is. That content varies from brassica species to brassica species. So like kale, if you're familiar with kale, very popular in the human diet, right? Mm-hmm. That has higher SMCO content than the forage rape and turnip varieties. So once it gets above a critical level, we tend to see more problems with anemia. So what I've inferred from our results is that we probably would have some SMCO in our brassica, but it wasn't high enough to cause problems. And the plant breeders who breed brassica have become aware of this and are breeding like lower. They're trying to find strains or varieties that are lower in SMCO content. So the answer to that, I'd say we didn't see a problem. I think I'd be a little more concerned if I was grazing maybe kale. But in the forage rape and turnips, our SMCO was apparently low enough not to cause problems.
Okay. So we've passed through all the questions we've had from our audience. So people, it's 12. So question period is over.
Time for lunch.
You did good. I maybe had one. Do you in the US ration your lambs when they're close to going to slaughter? Like you feed them ad libitum, and then do you ration them for them not to put too much fat by the end of?
Oh, okay. So do you limit them kind of right before? Yeah. No.
No. Okay.
I don't know anyone who does that. Yeah. Oh, do you fast them overnight, do you mean, or just like slow them down for a few weeks?
Slow them down for a few weeks, not for them to put too much fat. No?
Is that something I can like? Do you guys do that with any of your?
Well, I think there's two methods here that producers are doing. Some of them are going on an accelerated growth rate, and others when when females or males are reaching a certain weight, they stop the ad libitum feeding, I should say, and they ration them. So when they ration them, what it means is that we give them a little bit more forage and we slow them down on the grain before slaughtering them. So I was wondering if it was a method that you were doing in the US.
No, I don't know anybody who does that. Like that's the sort of thing like we do like when we develop replacement ewe lambs, that's exactly what we do. You know, we grow them fast, and then when they get this certain body fatness, we want to slow their growth down.
Mm-hmm.
I might do that like for my market lambs I'm killing for my own self, because I don't want them to get excessively fat. But we don't get paid. We get paid for gain. We don't get paid for quality, which is kind of silly.
Okay.
And so people just want them as big as possible. So it's not a common practice here, but I understand the thought. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Richard, for being with us. I invite people to fill in the survey in English or in French. The webinar was recorded, so it will be on our website for those who would like to listen to it in another period. So that was it. Maybe you can stay with us a little bit, Richard, or did you have another course or something?
Nope.
Were you? Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for being with us this morning. You gave a good presentation, Richard.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we're off the air now.
There's still more people with us.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Ouais.
Yeah, I a little bit.
Est-ce que tu as arrêté l'enregistrement de ton côté?